Everyone. We are so excited to have all of you here today. I'm Bethany and I'm with AARP Idaho. I'm their intern right now. So before we get started, just in the class, I just wanted to go over a few ground rules just about the class and also introduce Chris and everything that he'll be talking about today and some of his background, and then I'll also go over how New Knowledge Adventures NKA started. So just a few ground rules. You participants can leave the class at any time. All microphones will be muted just to make sure that we can continue learning everything throughout the class. And if you do have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat the whole time and making sure that Chris sees them and Chris knows about them, so that way we can make sure to get your questions answered. And then we do ask as well that you just stick to professional language and or behavior during the class. So a little bit of a background about NKA. Over 15 years ago, a group of dedicated volunteers came together to create a lifelong learning program in Pocatello in partnership with Idaho State University. And these volunteers looked at many different models and decided to create New Knowledge Adventures, which is why we're here today. And currently, right now in the fall of 2020, NKA Treasure Valley is offering online classes due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are the only NKA group in Idaho offering online classes. So that's very exciting. And then a little bit about Chris, who's teaching the class today, is that for 35 years, Chris was a speech language pathologist in the public schools. And when he retired in 2008, he picked up a camera. Since retiring, he has photographed local events, several weddings, and a few portrait settings. And his images have been made available to the public through 10 gallery exhibits and his website. So again, we are so excited that you all are here today, and we're so excited just to learn from Chris. And I will hand it over to you, Chris.
Good morning, everyone. So we're going to be talking about long exposure photography. I'm assuming that the majority of you have a camera that you have settings on and that you can remove the lens. There'll be a lot of pictures. If you're just a point and shoot photographer, you'll find the information interesting, and you'll have a lot of interesting pictures to look at. But some of the specifics on how you take the pictures might not be as relevant to you. This presentation will show you how to control light for images like these. These are all short exposure images. Okay. You will also be able to take pictures like these. These are short exposure. But first, I need to tell you how to use the knobs, switches, and settings on your camera to control light. While this presentation includes the images from my camera, it also contains images from the internet. I suggest, firstly, that you keep your phone camera handy to photograph any slides which you would like to keep for your personal reference. Secondly, you might want to open Word. At the end of this slideshow, there are several links which you may wish to copy and paste into the Word document. They will then be available to copy into your browser, and they may even be clickable. I'm not certain of that. The word photography is a combination of two Greek words, photo and graphy, or light drawing. Photography is all about managing light. The exposure triangle is your key to controlling light. There's aperture, the shutter speed, and ISO. They all affect how much light comes into your camera and lands on your sensor. The exposure triangle. Your camera settings determine how much light enters your camera and falls onto your camera sensor, as I said. The settings which control exposure are ISO, which is the light sensitivity of your camera's sensor. The shutter speed, how long the shutter is open, and the aperture, the diameter, the internal diameter of your lens opening. Now, for years, I pronounced that ISO. So you hear both ISO and ISO. But in preparing for the workshop, I saw that they said, oh no, it's ISO. You don't spell it out. Okay. So here's an analogy to help you understand camera exposure, your light controls. Suppose you want to fill a bathtub with 10 inches of water. You could adjust ISO, how fast the water is flowing, the sensitivity of your light sensor, your camera sensor. Shutter speed, how long the water is flowing into the tub, and aperture, that's if you could adjust the diameter of your faucet. Now you could reach the 10-inch goal using just one of those or any settings of the three. And the same is true with your camera. Various combinations of your settings can result in the same exposure. I'll provide the settings which I used for most of my images. So there's no magical combination of settings. Like what I used isn't the end all and be all of what the setting should be to take that picture. Many combinations will yield the same exposure. Your settings will depend upon your creative vision. And as I discuss each of the three legs of the exposure triangle, there are benefits, there are effects that you may want to have or avoid. So to make your creative vision, you would consider those and use those exposure elements. So on your camera, you've got a number of shooting modes. The automatic modes, the computer in your camera automatically adjusts the exposure triangle and other settings for your camera's best guess at a properly exposed point and shoot image. In the automatic settings, they have built-in settings for exposure and features which work for typical images. For instance, for sports, you would want a fast shutter speed and continuous shots. For children, you want a fast shutter speed to freeze your child's movement so they're not all blurred. Night photography, you would want a high ISO to get in as much light as possible in the dark. Landscape, you'd want a large depth of field. In the creative modes, you can control some exposure settings on your camera, and your camera manages the remaining exposure settings. For Canon, you've got TV and AV, time value and aperture value. For Nikon, you've got S for shutter speed and A for aperture. All right. In time value, you select the shutter speed for freeze or blur, and your camera sets the ISO and aperture automatically for a correctly exposed image. And the lovely thing about this is if you're pointing the camera here and it's pretty well lit, then you turn to your left and you take another picture and it's not so well lit, your camera adjusts the aperture and the ISO so that you have a good exposure. For aperture value, you set the aperture value is called the F number, and so you'll use those interchangeably. You set the F number, or the aperture. It controls both light and depth of field. So generally, you'll make your decision based, if you're shooting daylight, you'll generally make that decision based on the depth of field that you want. So you set the aperture, and the depth of field stays the same. And your camera adjusts the shutter speed and ISO automatically for a correctly exposed image. So shutter priority and aperture priority are two of the creative modes. The third one, and most challenging, is manual mode. The problem with manual mode is the strength of manual mode is that you can set all three legs of the exposure triangle yourself. The problem is they stay set. So if you point your camera to the right in the well-lit area, you get one kind of picture. You turn to the left in the dark area, your camera doesn't adjust to the environment that you're shooting into. So you're almost better off with aperture priority or shutter priority. So just in case we have Nikon users, here's a comparison of the Canon mode dial and the Nikon mode dial. And you can see these are the automatic modes: auto, portrait, landscape, macro, sports, night portrait, no flash, child. And then the manual: aperture priority, shutter priority, and program. Did I say manual? On my Canon, the mode dial is on the right. When I was looking for pictures for Nikon, I saw it on both the right and on the left. But it's the clunky knob on the top. Correct exposure. Using the exposure triangle, you can create correctly exposed images. Insufficient light results in an underexposed image. Underexposed image. Too much light results in an overexposed image, also referred to as a blown out image. Now, if you do post-processing on your computer, the blown out areas, there's no information here, and so you won't be able to retrieve it. With an overexposed image, you will be able to get these dark things and bring that out so you can see really well. You adjust the shadows, and the midtones disappear, and you can see the details of that rock. And of course, you want the correctly exposed image. Okay, as AARP members, you will all remember buying film. Bethany may not remember. Bethany, have you ever bought film for a camera?
I remember my mom buying it. I didn't, but yeah, I remember my mom doing it.
Okay, so Bethany, when you buy film, you have to anticipate where you're going to be shooting. If you're going to be shooting in bright daylight, you'll buy ASA 100 to 200. If it's going to be overcast skies, you'd buy ASA 400. If it was going to be low light situations, like maybe a birthday party indoors with minimal light, you'd want to have ASA 800 or 1000. These numbers refer to the light sensitivity of the film. As the ASA number increases, the film was more sensitive to the available light. We've entered the digital age, your age, her age. In the digital age, we have a light sensor in our cameras in place of the film. When we change the ISO setting, the light sensitivity of the camera sensor is changed electronically. As with film, we use low numbers, low sensitivity to light, for well-lit situations, and higher numbers, greater light sensitivity, for low-light situations. ASA, for film, stood for the American Standards Association. ISO, in the digital world, is the International Organization of Standards, pronounced ISO, not spelled out, I was told. Note, the higher the ISO number, light sensitivity, the greater the risk of grain or noise in your images. Noise or grain is the loss of image sharpness, as here. Okay, aperture. Now we're getting to meat and potatoes. If you were to take the removable lens off of your camera and look straight down the middle of it and rotate the barrel of the camera, you would notice that it would go from a pinpoint hole allowing light in. These leaves would open up, open up, open up, and you would have a larger hole. And depending on the length of your camera and the make of your camera, you'll have different aperture sizes available to you. Now, in naming these, it's confusing. They've introduced a lot of confusion in the photography world. A small f number, 1.8, I think the lowest my cameras go to is 3 point something. So a 1.8 or a 1.4 is called a fast lens, and it gives you loads of light. You can almost take pictures in a dance hall with minimal lighting and do very well. So a small f number is a large aperture or opening, and it lets in bags of light. A large f number is a very small opening, and obviously it doesn't let in as much light. So you can see that the f number is a way to control how much light's coming into your image. So small f number, big hole, more light. Big f number, small hole, less light. So we'll have another, we'll get to it, I guess. In addition to changing the amount of light allowed to fall onto your camera sensor, the f number, aperture, also determines how much of your image is in focus. This is referred to as depth of field, or DOF. The easiest way to remember the relationship between f number and DOF is big f number, big depth of field. Small f number, small depth of field. You might take a picture of this slide. You'll need that more than many of the other things I'm going to tell you about. The longer focal length also results in a shallower or smaller DOF, depth of field. For example, over here we've got f22, and you can see all this background stuff, which if you were doing a landscape and you wanted people to look at the mountains over here and see the people in front, that'd be really cool. But here, that kind of distracts you from the beauty of this plant. Over here at f1.4, this is called bokeh, and it's just a blurred background, and so the eye is drawn, and you notice how much more detail you see of this plant than you initially saw of that plant. Depth of field in relation to aperture. With a small f number, we get a small depth of field. Only one pirate is in focus here. And as we increase the f number, more and more pirates come out of the fog until at f22, all of them are focused. Any questions about depth of field? Bethany? Okay.
No, the chat is all clear. Yeah, but if anyone does, feel free to put it in the chat. It'll be on the bottom of your screen, and you'll see a little chat logo.
All right, this slide kind of it combines what I've just talked about for aperture. As we go from a small aperture, large f number, you see that the aperture increases in diameter till we get down to a very small f number. The further we go this direction, the more light enters the camera and the faster shutter speed you're able to use. So with the faster your shutter speed, the less light is coming in. So you compensate so you're getting more light here and less light with the shutter speed. So this allows you to have a faster shutter speed and still have a well-exposed picture. That makes sense? So again, looking at these, coming down here, the further we go this direction, we increase the depth of field, but we need a slower shutter speed to allow that same amount of light to come into the sensor. So here they've got a picture of a good depth of field and less, and then less. It's easy to get confused because we're talking about the depth of field and the amount of light. So a small f number is more light, but a smaller depth of field. Big, small, big. Oh, big, small, big. So you get a big f number, less light, big depth of field. That's why I say just think of a small f number is a small depth of field. A big f number is a big depth of field. That'll serve you very well. Shutter speed. Is how long your sensor is exposed to light. As with film cameras, the shutter speed determines how long the sensor is exposed to light. If there's no motion, if there is motion, you and your subject, let me try that one more time. If there is motion, you or your subject, the sensor will capture it and it will blur. With a fast shutter speed, a short exposure, you can freeze the action of your subject. A long exposure will result in image blur and require a tripod. So we're going blur to freezing action. When the shutter opens for 1 second, the pinwheel spins around several times. This motion is recorded on your sensor. With shorter shutter opening times, less and less movement is recorded. At 1/60th of a second shutter speed, the pinwheel appears not to move. It is frozen in time. And waterfall at 3 different speeds. So this one's an interesting comparison because he gives both the F number and the shutter duration. So here at 125th of a second, a relatively fast shutter speed, you can see that the water is frozen there. As he increases the shutter opening time, the water begins to blur, and at half a second, it becomes a bit milky. I mean, the water doesn't always come across the exact same place and just make one image. It moves around. I think you can see best when you look at the water down here. See how it's blurry together? And then over here, it's more crisp, and you can see elements of it. The interesting thing is in looking at the F numbers. So with a fast shutter speed, he has used f2.8. So there's a lot of aperture there to let more light in. Over here, f22 is not very, the aperture is not very wide open, and he's left the shutter open for a half second. So being open for a half second, a lot of light comes in. So to avoid blowing out the image, he has reduced the aperture so less light comes in that way. You see how it's potentially confusing. Freezing action, fast, short, or short shutter speed. To freeze action, select a shutter speed higher than the length in millimeters at which you are shooting. If you are shooting at 400 millimeters, use 1/500th of a second or faster, and that will freeze the action. And of course, the faster you go, the more freezing you'll get. An easy way to capture fast-moving subjects is to select the sports mode on your mode dial. The automatic setting for sports mode include a short shutter speed and continuous shooting, quickly repeated shutter actions, as long as you hold the shutter button down. You'll end up with many, many images from which you can select your favorites. So this is another picture you may want to take, another slide you may want to get a picture of. It's a cheat sheet for shutter speed. At 1/4000th, you could freeze the action of a water balloon being popped. And if you had continuous, you would have a number of images you could select from to say, ooh, I like this one, I don't like that one. Down to like a minute for milky water effect, or over a minute for long exposures for stars, star trails, and night photography. This is a photo I took at a dance competition in Portland. And you can see how the faster shutter speeds froze the action. I went to the rodeo in 2018, and a young photographer was in the arena taking pictures. I call this image Snap because when the bull hit him, if you look right here, I've lost my cursor, the expensive long lens on his camera broke in half. Because, okay, fortunately my camera was in shutter priority mode, so I had a fast shutter speed and I didn't have to worry about ISO or aperture because they were adjusting themselves. As I was set for continuous shooting, I captured this series of images. And it's lovely because I was up in the top row of the bleachers, and as you can see, we had the silhouette of the crowd kind of framing the image. Neither was hurt, incidentally. So if you notice, they've got these banners down here that say Coca-Cola. You see on the back of the banners, they say, enjoy every moment. Another interesting element about this series of pictures is if you look at the position of the, oh, there it is. Look at the position of the camera lens in each successive picture. So this all happened before the lens settled on the ground. You see in this picture, the camera lens hasn't completely fallen to the ground yet. And then this quick blurred picture showed him walking away with his camera lens and camera in hand. Cool. These are some short shutter speed images that I captured at different, this is the Spartan Run in Parma. This is Purim at a Jewish festival. This is a race. This is a man in Europe who is doing flips. These are the summer wind skippers. They're kids who in their elementary years for part of their PE program worked on jump roping. And now as adults, they continue to put on performances. This was at a roller derby competition, as was this image. This is called Shooting the Moose. This is Jessica Rabbit, is her roller derby name. These are pictures from the Spartan Run. And with a short shutter speed, we froze the action, froze the mud. This is the fountain outside of the Red Lion in Garden City, and a fast shutter speed froze the movement of the water. These images are not, regrettably, they're not pictures that I've taken, but you can see the water is frozen and the flailing fish is frozen, and you get a nice, crisp, detailed image. Look at the eye of that eagle. Long shutter speed, blurring the action. To blur action, depending upon your artistic vision, the subject matter, to blur action, depending upon your artistic vision and subject matter, you can leave your shutter open several seconds, several minutes, half an hour. For these images, you will want to use your tripod to hold the camera steady so that the only movement you're capturing is the movement of your subject. Use your tripod when your shutter speed is slower than 1 over the focal length. If shooting at 18 millimeters, that would be less than 1 over 18th of a second shutter speed that you could shoot handheld. For long exposures using the tripod, you should also, we're going to jump. On the camera, on the side of the camera, you have a switch so you can go from autofocus to manual focus, and you have a switch that's either VC or IS for image stabilization or vibration compensation. In Nikon cameras, the stabilizer is in the camera, and in Canon, they're in the lens. In the Canon lenses, they've got three little motors that compensate. If you move the lens a little bit to one way, it'll compensate by moving the focus back and forth. So it allows you to be a little bit sloppy in holding your camera, and it allows you to hold it at longer shutter speeds. Okay, so you want to turn off the image stabilization IS or VC vibration compensation, and once you have your focus, switch to manual focus, because the image stabilization on the tripod will sense movement where there is no movement, and it'll keep moving your lens, giving you blur. The autofocus will continue to zoom in and out, looking for focus. So once you've got your focus, go to manual focus, and then you don't have to worry about those two things. Well, Bethany, we talked about AARP members buying film. Before our time, photographers used a bulb. You can see the bulb here by the, I don't know why my cursor keeps disappearing. They used a bulb in taking pictures. Now that bulb, to take long exposures, photographers used tripods. To take the photo, they would squeeze a pneumatic bulb. This caused a pin to depress the shutter button, so the photographer wouldn't have to touch his camera, eliminating unintentional camera movement and unwanted blur. Bulb today. Some cameras have a dedicated B on the mode dial. On others, you have to enter the manual mode and increase exposure duration. At the longest extreme of shutter exposure, as you increase the shutter duration, the shutter speed, you'll find either B or bulb. Your shutter will stay open as long as the shutter button is depressed or your wired remote button is depressed. I typically use bulb with trial and error for long exposures. And the reason for that is I can quickly, I can change the length of time I'm holding the button down more easily than going into the menu and going here and changing that, and it's just easier for me. If you hold the button down too long, the image will be overexposed. Like if you're shooting fireworks and you hold it down 5 or 7 seconds, so much light has gone up there that a lot of it's blown out. If you don't hold it down long enough, it won't necessarily be underexposed, but you won't get as interesting a picture as if you held it longer and let more fireworks go in front of the screen. So you can see on this image that they've got a B for bulb on the dial. And then on Canon and Nikon's exposure dials, you can see where the M is, and that is for the manual mode, in which you find your bulb setting, your bulb option. Live view, in the olden days, Bethany, in the olden days, you would go and you'd take your pictures, you would come home, you'd send your film off to get developed, and then you'd find out that your camera strap was in front of your lens, or your lens cap was on, or you weren't properly exposed, or you had the wrong settings, and your pictures of Hawaii weren't what you hoped they'd be. Nowadays, you've got a screen on the back of your camera, and you can push this little button and see exactly what you're going to get. Technology. All right, you can preview your image with live view. With it, you can see the effect of your exposure settings on the image. Live view will display what your image will look like once captured. In live view, you can also magnify the image to check your focus. You can use autofocus to get a good starting focus, switch to manual focus, magnify the image, and then in manual focus, further adjust the focus so you get as good a focus as you possibly can have. I generally start with an ISO of 100 and as small an F number as my focal length will allow so that I have as much light as possible to start with. Another reason for getting as small an F number is I don't want to get grain. Now grain in the digital cameras is usually in very large numbers, but I just don't want to go there. All right, so as you can see here, this little white camera button, that is the live view button. When you press it on your screen, you'll see the image, and as you make adjustments, you'll see the effect on that. So once you've done the autofocus and you've turned it off to manual, go into live view, and then over here on the right, on the Canon, you see the magnifying glass with the plus and the minus. If you push the plus, it'll give you a 5 power zoom in, and then a 10 power zoom in, and then it'll go back to the full view. So it allows you to, I do this a lot when I'm taking lunar photography. I'll get on my tripod, I'll get it all set up. I will get as good a focus as autofocus will give me. I'll turn to manual focus. Then I will use the magnify button to zoom in even closer to the moon so that I can make fine adjustments manually to see if I've got a good margin of the moon. The exposure triangle with effects. Aperture, a small f number is a small, small f number is a small depth of field, but you get more light. A big F number is a big depth of field, less light. ISO, a small number lets in less, is less light sensitivity for well-lit situations. A big number, more light sensitivity for low light situations with the risk of grain. Shutter speed, a short shutter speed freezes the image, but it has less light enters during the short opening, and a long shutter speed allows for blur, a blurred image, and more light to enter during the long exposure. So this is just another way of saying what I just said. And now that I don't have my mouse for some reason, with aperture, going from top down to the lower left, you have a small f number, which is more light, and a shallow depth of field. As you move down, the depth of field becomes larger. You're getting less light, and you've got a larger f number. Moving over to the right for ISO. With a small ISO of 100, you have less light coming in, but you have a nice crisp image. The bigger the ISO number, and the reason you'd go to a bigger number is to get more light. That's the main reason you'd use ISO, but you have the risk of grain in that top image. Shutter speed, starting on the left with a long shutter opening of 4 seconds, or 1/4 of a second. A small shutter speed. Okay, so 1/4 of a second is a long shutter opening. You have more light coming in with blur. You get more sharpness as you move to the right with more light at 1/1000th of a second. Excuse me, less light. So that's why I'm suggesting if you want, you can take pictures of these so you can look at them. Here's some more blur. Here's some blurred waterfalls. So you're on a tripod. You've got a long shutter speed. So as the rocks are not moving, okay. The rocks are not moving, so they're nice and crisp. I've seen a number of pictures of a stream where there's a rock that's really crisp and they've got a leaf or something on it for some color, and the water rushing by is all milky and blurred. Now, down near Twin Falls on the Snake River, they've got a couple of really nice, very tall waterfalls on the north bank near a fish hatchery. Again, you see how nice and crisp these rocks are because they are not moving. The image on my picture is someplace where they've got glacial ice on the beach. And during the long exposure, the water came in and the water went out. Actually, if you look right down here at these rocks, I think that the water came in and he didn't start the exposure until the water started going back out again. And you can see that there's a lot of action out here in the waves, out in here. And these rocks weren't moving, or these chunks of glacial ice weren't moving. This is an image I took at Glacier National Park. I was just learning to use manual during that trip. So the rocks are almost in focus, but I just thought this was way cool the way the water was moving around. So as I mentioned before, with many of my images, I'll provide the shutter speed that I used, the aperture, and the ISO. But consider those as a starting place. Make the images your own and come up with your own values that meet your creative vision. These are two of my pictures that I really like. They're from Catherine Albertson's park. I had a very short, I had like a 2 or 3 second shutter speed, and I was directing my camera to the lily pads, and it was kind of a surprise when it first happened. The reflection from the foliage, the fall colors on the right or the spring colors on the left, were made very Monet-like as the wind moved across the water and the water moved. All right, so there's two things that you'll want to do with your night photography. One is limiting light, and the other is gathering light. For fireworks, the moon and lightning, very, very bright subjects. You'll want to tone them down. When you look at the moon, you just see a white blur. If you take a picture with your cell phone, it's just a white blur. But if you reduce the light, as you reduce the light, looking in live view, you will begin to see the details of the moon. All right, so I generally start with a low ISO, 100. My camera doesn't go less, but 100 for less noise. Bright subjects like firework, moon, and lightning. An aperture of f11 to f16 reduces the overly bright moon. The white balance I set to sun because the subjects, the moon is actually reflecting sunlight, but the fireworks and lightning are very bright subjects. For my shutter speed with the moon, I use 1/125th of a second, so a faster shutter speed. I don't want to let in much light. With fireworks, I will use bulb because the firework isn't lasting long in the sky, and I can get an accumulation of firework activity and spark movement with a longer exposure. So around 2 to 3 seconds, much more than that, and they'll blow out because you want to capture the spark movement. For lightning, I call this fishing for light. With lightning, I'll get all set up. I'll find out where the lightning has been hitting, and I will just sit patiently and hold the shutter open for 10 seconds, recording the darkness. And then when lightning strikes, I've got a picture of lightning. It's really, of course, you have to be in a place where you can see lightning, but you're not getting wet. Stars, Milky Way, and star trails, you're trying to gather light over time. So I'll start with a 1600 ISO to gather, to let the light soak in. Obviously, I'm on the tripod. An aperture of, say, 3.5, which is as small as my camera lens will go to get in as much light as possible. A shutter speed of, say, 20 seconds for more light, and to minimize, if I don't want star trails, to minimize the star trailing. And I'll use, with star trails, you use continuous shoot. This is something new to me. I just figured this out in preparing this presentation. Continuous shooting for the star trails. You'll get many images which can be stacked for star trail images. You'll also need a locking wired shutter release. You can get them on Amazon for like $8. And this avoids you having to hold your finger on the shutter button and shake and introduce zigzaggy lines. These are a couple of my moon shots. Now I have to admit, in post-processing, what do they call it? I can't think of the setting right now, but I had to make it, I made it a little bit more sharp to show off the details. They weren't in my original image. So you zoom in on the moon in live view, refine your focus with manual focus and with the magnifier. This one was a large moon we had recently, and it was covered in clouds. I thought it was a fun picture. Fireworks. So everyone knows Hawk Stadium. In the good old days, every summer at all the home games, Hawk Stadium would have fireworks. So I'd drive from Nampa to Boise, and I'd set up in their parking lot with 2 cameras on tripods with my wired latching remote releases, and I would just fire. Because after you've captured like 2 or 3 seconds of fireworks, then your camera has to process that to be ready to take another picture. So I'm going alternately back and forth taking these pictures. One of my favorites, I call it Midnight at the Oasis. This is several seconds of fireworks. So there's a bunch of this set of fireworks went off, and then something came up here, and then the wind caught the sparks and gave it that 3-dimensional look. And anyway, I love that picture. This one I zoomed into the explosions within a firework to show the detail. Here you can see the stadium lights from Hawk Stadium as a silhouette in front of all the firework action. Here again, you can see the stadium lights, and you can see where just wonderful stuff as the wind blows sparks around. Now, one year I took the camera. One camera I didn't get as good a focus, and none of those pictures were worth anything. The other camera worked fine. And then here's another of my firework pictures. It's lovely we have that at Hawk Stadium, because otherwise you'd just be limited to the 4th of July to get any pictures. So again, use your smallest focal length on your camera so you get more sky. Try and frame it so that you are pointing about where most of the fireworks are going off. So when I first get to Hawk Stadium, the first thing I do is I will adjust the focus on my camera so that the stadium lights are in focus. And again, I'll use the autofocus, then I'll go into manual, then I'll use live view to focus. One year, probably 2 years ago, when I reviewed those pictures, I had an amazing vision. It's so serendipitous. The insects flying in front of the stadium lights during that time, that longer exposure, I caught their movements. So they're well lit from the stadium lights, and the shutter is staying open, so we can track their movements. This one, I don't know much about bugs, but I found this one really interesting because you see all these little wing flaps here, and follow his patterns and all the stuff he's doing. These were on the internet, and these are fireflies. So they were similar to what I was doing with my stadium light insects. This one is not a long exposure, but it's really sweet. In 2017, we had an eclipse. So what you do with an eclipse is you use a filter, a solar filter, and then at totality, you can take the filter off. So I took a Dixie cup, cut the bottom of it off, and glued a filter onto the top so that I could just reach down, lift it off during totality, then put it right back on. This is called the wedding ring, or engagement ring, I think it is. And this is my totality solar eclipse picture. And if you look at noon and 2 o'clock, you can see solar flares. So that would be short shutter speed. Lightning, fishing for light, as I've told you. The thing I thought was really interesting was these two separate lightning bolts looked like they could have been one image. So you're on a tripod, point the camera to the area of recent lightning, focus your lens to infinity, or you may need to, before it gets dark, focus on something very distant and then leave your lens set that way. I capture 10-second intervals so that it doesn't blow out, and I'm just recording the dark sky. And when the lightning strikes in view of your camera, during the 10-second interval, then you can capture the lightning. And if you look down here at the bottom, you can see where cars were driving by on the freeway. And so we got a long exposure of their tail lights. What I have failed to do and what I think I should be doing is I should keep the button pressed so that after the lightning I captured, possibly I'll catch another couple of strikes in the same picture. And these are actually, this is over Nampa, and there's the freeway. Look how massive that was. That was incredible. And they give off kind of a purplish. Oh. The state fair is a lot of fun. So the top 3 images are different shutter speeds of the same subject. So the first one, the ride is parked. The second one, I don't have the different speeds for those, but the next is a little bit longer shutter speed, and since the people weren't moving, they're frozen there. And then the third one is a much longer one, and you can see the people are a little bit blurred because they've moved during the exposure. You recognize the Ferris wheel. Now I love this ride on the last 2 images. It's got these chains that hang down and swings, and so since it was, you can see how the people are kind of blurred in those 2 images. So this is the same ride. And you can see in the background the Ferris wheel in another ride. You can follow the lines in those. So this is that same ride. It was stationary. I had a long exposure, and during the long exposure, I zoomed away from I zoomed out. And in doing so, the colors just dragged and made an interesting picture. This image, you could do this in shutter priority with a flash. So when you take the picture, the flash captures details of this train. And so you get those details, but then the flash goes away and the long exposure captures the movement of the train as it goes away from you. And because they use between an F-16 and an F-20 to F-22, the lights become stars. Here are 2 more where there was an initial flash and a long exposure. Now you could do this either in shutter priority or in manual. So with the flash, you're able to capture the number of this train. and the people. And in this one, again, they were in F16 to F22, so the lights are stars. In the top right, they captured the number of the bus. This is probably a London double-decker bus. I'm guessing because of the phone booth. I haven't tried this. I asked a local fire station if I could do it there because it looks really risky. This image, you take a whisk and you put a Brillo pad or a piece of stainless or a piece of steel wool in the cage of the whisk, and you have a chain hanging from it, and you start spinning it around. Oh, sorry. You light it on fire, and then you spin it around, and the sparks fly. The bottom left-hand picture, there was a body of water, or they had gotten the ground wet. Anyway, it's reflecting the sparks. So these are vehicle light trails. It's a still camera and moving lights. In the right, these are cars going to the red lights and coming from the white lights, the Golden Gate Bridge. So the camera is stationary and the cars are traveling. The other three images are things I've taken on Highway 84 or I-84. I had the camera on the tripod setting in the car as I drove down the freeway with long exposures. In this one, you can see the speed limit sign in the back. This is a vehicle, a double-decker vehicle transport bouncing down the highway. So the image reflects the movement of my car and camera and the movement of the other vehicle bouncing down the highway. And my favorite piece of this image is the crisp yellow line echoing the movement of the red lines. Panning. You use a moving camera with a moving subject. So this wouldn't be a very long shutter speed because he's fairly crisp and you don't see his legs moving. You see his foot moving a little bit. But what you do is you point the camera at the person and follow him along. And so the stationary things are blurred in the background, and it gives a feel for motion. Here's camera movement with a still subject. These people have found something they saw interesting that was stationary, and then during the long shutter exposure, they moved their cameras to make creative images. Invisible people, a still camera and moving people. If during a long exposure,